Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you for joining us for today's talk, Encountering Rapid Mobility and World-Classness in Transport Paraphernalia by Yogi Joseph. This talk is part of the South Asia Speaker Series organized by the Department of Religions and Cultures. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from fourth space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities to examine the research questions and projects in development here at the university. We are running this event as a live stream meeting, so we welcome your comments and questions with a raised hand or via the chat if you're joining us by Zoom. And for those of you who are here in this space, if you'd like to participate, just please raise a hand and we'll be sure to get a microphone to you. With that, it is now my pleasure to hand it over to Assistant Professor in the Department of Religions and Cultures, Dr. Sopernika Balaswaminathan. Balaswaminathan.
Perfect. Thank you, Shaki. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second of the 6 talks that we have planned out as part of the Southern Asia Studies speaker series at Concordia University. Thank you all for being here in person as well as online. One of the main goals of these talks has been to introduce the very innovative and dynamic work that's being done by our early career scholars at Concordia. And that's why we have a few student scholars who are going to be presenting on their work. Our first student speaker giving the talk Encountering Rapid Mobility and World-Classness in Transport Paraphernalia is Yogi Joseph, who is a PhD candidate at the Department of Geography, Planning and Environment at Concordia University, Montreal. He is deeply interested in manifesting a bottom-up understanding of infrastructure in the global South, paying close attention to the micro-practices employed in transit spaces. He views them as key sites for the production of socialities. His recent work investigates the role of transit infrastructure in forming subjectivities and shaping citizenships. So as Jackie mentioned, we'll have a Q&A at the end of the talk, but in the meantime, if people have questions, they can always drop it in the chat box. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it on to Yogi.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Sopernika, for that introduction. I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity to present my work. This work has been going on for some time now. My work is part of the Constituting Indian Urban Mobility Project at Concordia, and it's supervised by my supervisors Govind and Craig, and I have Madhav on my committee. There is Sarah Turner from McGill on my committee. And there is the work of a lot of well-wishers, a lot of colleagues who are all interested in questions like this. What I present to you today is just 1/3, maybe? Yeah, 1/3 of what constitutes my thesis, which I'm hoping to defend sometime later this year or early next year. We're not sure, depending on how everything pans out. But today I'm here to talk to you about ideas of rapidness and world-classness as we encounter them in transport infrastructure in India, which is where I'm from, and I'm deeply invested in how transport, mobility, and equity, and all these concepts are deployed or engaged with at a micro level, a meso level, and a macro level. In any case, what you will see today is a snapshot of the work that I've been doing these days. So off we go. So the research question that I'm engaging with All right. So the research question that I'm engaging today with is, first of all, how are these ideas of rapidness and world-classness operationalized in the context of transport infrastructure? But more importantly, both from the perspective of my research as part of the thesis, but also for those who are interested in mobility studies, what are the implications of hyphenating rapidness or world-classness to other modes of mobility, which do not kind of fall in the same category as the infrastructures that I'm talking about today? What I found through my research is that these values, these ideas of rapidness and world-classness are closely connected. And as I run you through my slides today, you will see why. But before I do that, let me also quickly take you through what the literature talks about on rapidness first and world-classness. So there's a lot of work that's happening on three major themes. There is talk about efficiency. There is work on disembodied mobilities. I call them disembodied because as we talk more and more about speed and rapidness, I see that we are talking about something which is far away from what you experience on a day-to-day basis. So there were trains, and now we're talking about, like hyperloops, etc. And each time we go up one level, the sense that I get is that you are talking less and less about your experiences as while experiencing fast mobilities, and more about the technologies which make this happen. So there is work by Vanini, which kind of who kind of looks at the fast versus slow ways of living. There is work by Jonathan Shapiro and Jaria, who talks about slow ways of looking at food in Indian cities. Very interesting work that is. There is also a sense of competition between countries and cities on which country or which pairs of cities have the fastest trains running between them. We know that recently we have had discussions in North America about having high-speed rail on the Windsor-Quebec City corridor, while we struggle every winter and every spring with disruptions on our existing network. So there are questions there. There's also talk about how this competition kind of brings in more money for research on technology. So there is maglev and other kind of things that are being talked about. But most importantly here, there is a sense in countries like India to look at speed as a means of having arrived on the global stage, a sense of community, a sense of membership into a select club. And that is where the problems actually start. What you see on your screen right now is a rapid rail transit system, which is now being proposed to connect the capital city of Delhi with settlements in a neighborhood province called Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, and Rajasthan. Once done, people will be able to travel 180 kilometers one way, so 360 kilometers a day in these examples of rapid transit. What it does is it changes your way of life. It also makes it easier for corporations to hire cheaper workforce from far, far, far away from the city. So it has implications on labor-capital relations. It has implications on urban planning. It has implications on environment and all of those things. But the dominant discourse these days in India is about the speed. So there are videos, there are reels on social media which kind of fetishize the speed one experiences when one of these passes you at one of the many stations that fall along, which is kind of perverse, if you ask me, in a country where there is mass poverty even now, despite having pulled out millions of people from poverty in the preceding 2 or 3 decades. So there are problems with that. There is also discussions around world-classness, and here planners and policymakers use multiple tools, and some of these tools result in the widening of the gap between the haves and the have-nots. So some of the tools that they use are policy design and the use of materials. So policies are designed in such a way that they encourage the creation of special economic zones where the normal law of the land is not applicable and where exploitation of labor is more than welcome. Then there is also material design. So there is work by the likes of Rashmi Sadana and Matti Simitiaki, who have looked at how architectural design and planning can be used by policymakers to help achieve these ideas of world-classness in metro rail and other pieces of infrastructure that we have had over the last 2 decades. There is also discussions on how these projects are increasingly happening at the periphery of Indian cities, where land is comparatively cheaper, regulation is a lot more lax, and therefore capital is able to bring together land and invest in properties such as townships, which are both cut off from the everyday realities, but in some senses they are also inaccessible to a vast section of the population. So this kind of enclavation and overall urban disconnect has now become a part of our urbanism, and that has problems. So I was looking at these ideas of rapidness and world-classness, and I found that they are very similar in their use of information technology-driven infrastructures. They're also very similar in the fact that they cause exclusion, and some of these exclusions can thankfully turn into resistance and unfortunately into contestation, violent contestation, which can have implications on how the society and the economy works. But apart from that, you have a reconfiguration of transport spaces and bypassing congestion points. These are prominent themes in the work of scholars that deal with mobility studies. And my own thesis actually features a lot of these ideas very prominently. There is also infrastructure studies where we talk about the splintering and unbundling of networks, which again have exclusionary results, and they have implications again on the quality of life in our urban centers and also the interclass relations. There is also work which talks about an excess of infrastructure. Now, this is kind of counter to our usual idea of countries such as India, where we have vast stretches of the country where we do not have adequate water supply, sewerage services, etc. And yet there are urban centers where there is talk now of 24/7 water supply when you're only one drought away from having even what remains in terms of water supply taken away from you. I'm talking about cities like Chennai and Coimbatore, where these discussions are happening. So in this case, one could look at these discussions on infrastructures as fetishization, where cities need to have spectacles in order to be able to attract people, in order to be able to attract capital investments. And for that, there is one spectacle after the other. So there is, something as mundane as the inauguration of a new express train called Vande Bharat, then requires the arrival of the head of the country who goes to multiple cities to inaugurate this, and effectively turning these what you would consider basic infrastructures into objects of awe and fantasy. And that can have implications on how our democracy works. And so there are connections there which I would like to explore at some later point in my career. As we go further, I would want to introduce you to the overall planning, transport policy making scene in India. This is a graphic which kind of encapsulates 60 to 70 years of policy making. It is definitely not reflective of everything, but it is a capsule. So you can see that we have had a shift from predict and provide to sustainable transport. And then again, a combination of these two modes of thinking and the pandemic kind of bringing in a technological fix, but now capital land relations kind of causing a rethink of this technological fix. And again, going back to the predict and provide mode. So these are interesting debates that are currently happening, as a result of which now we have at least 30 cities in India where there is a metro rail system either in operation, under construction, or in proposal. If you look at this graphic, you will see that most of these systems are very recent, except Kolkata, which happens to be the oldest system, and Delhi, which was a landmark event in the case of India, because once Delhi had a metro in 2002 around the Asian Games, every other city now start aspiring for a metro system. I also want to bring your attention to the coverage of these systems. You will see Kanpur having only 9 kilometers of operational network as of now, versus a Delhi, which has 350 kilometers. So it is something, again, a lot of these cities aspire to. Many of these cities have a second or third phase going on. Now I bring you to the site that I'm working on, Kochi. It's a city that I have worked on for, in some capacity or the other, for the last decade or so. And I hope to be able to continue this connection for several decades or so, because it's a mine. There's so much to work on mobility in that city. You will see that it's a mid-density Tier 2 city, not a lot of population in comparison to Mumbai and Delhi, of course, but to a lot of other cities, 700,000 is a pretty good population. You will see that there's a lot of nature inside this city, not by design, but by accident. There is also a growing tendency for people to acquire personal vehicles. You have 245 vehicles per 1,000 now. And after the pandemic, it's getting incredibly worse. In my own experience and anecdotally. Moving in Kochi is a challenge, especially if you are not somebody that has access to cars. You will see that your life is always in danger. But again, I don't want to stereotype this, because people who live in Kochi, like other cities, develop tools of engaging with traffic in such a way that most of these complex maneuvers that you see the pedestrians doing right now are almost done by habit. So you're not as terrified as you are as you see it for the first time. There are very few avenues for pedestrians to walk safely, but considering that the public transport system in this city is a lot stronger than many other cities, I'm still kind of hopeful about being able to affect sustainable transport transitions in the city over the next couple of decades. Anyway, we move on now to a web of stakeholders, a complex web of stakeholders. And these are stakeholders that are linked to the central entity called Kochi Metro Rail Limited. It's a 50-50 equity company between the federal government, as it is called here, and the provincial government. But there are a lot of parastatal agencies, a lot of cooperative societies, a lot of special purpose vehicles that are interacting with the agency on a day-to-day basis. And because land is such a complex resource, and it's a stage for contestation, which I'm not going to get it now, but it kind of, this web of stakeholders kind of adds to its complexity. The city itself is, more or less like a peninsula. It has a very densely populated peninsula region, which is where the ancient port, not that ancient, actually, the recent, but during the colonial times, they started a port, which is where it is. And then there is a mainland kind of where newer development is happening. And what you see in green are the stations indicated on the alignment of the metro rail in the city. In terms of methods, I've used a combination of ethnography and discourse analysis. So I spent a lot of time, months in the city, tracking every sidewalk that was built along the metro rail, looking at important junctions videographing how traffic and people interact with the metro rail infrastructure. And I also spent a lot of time inside these transport spaces, looking at how people engage with the infrastructures, paying particular attention to the micro politics and the micro mobilities that people employ, just to be able to use the infrastructure. It doesn't, and in the end, what I found is it is not as easy as it appears in the brochures of the transport agencies. But more about that in a different paper. I also looked at around 600 newspaper reports between 2012 and 2023 in 4 major newspapers, 2 of them in the vernacular language of Malayalam, 2 of them widely circulated in English. And one of the limitations that I now realize is I should have also looked at local community-based newspapers, because that would have brought in an even greater wealth of information. Unfortunately, the pandemic kind of messed up a lot about my thesis research, and so I was not able to go to that depth. But sometime in the future, definitely. I'll get into this graphic later, but I kind of found 6 major themes that the coverage in these 4 major newspaper dailies covered. And I have a point to make here about the temporality of this coverage, about the themes of this coverage, etc. But I'll do that as we go later through the presentation. So when I went through these dailies, their idea of rapidness, and I kind of look at their idea of rapidness as a reflection of what the average Kochiite, and probably with a little bit of like bias towards the eliteness, elite Kochiite feels about rapidness. I borrow from the adage used by a former chief minister of the state of Kerala, Adivegam Bahuduram, which kind of encapsulates ideas of rapidness and the long haul. So he used this idea to kind of enable the deployment of the technology in rapid succession. So after a lot of debates, techno-managerial expert was identified, and contractors were identified, all with the view that the infrastructure had to be ready before the next cycle of elections. Development in India has a lot to do with election cycles, because politicians use every election as a way of staking their claim into the hearts of the voters. And so they use infrastructures as a way of staking that claim. I also look at Bahuduram, or going the distance, as a way of expanding our conception of the urban. So Kochi city, as you saw in a previous slide, is just around 95 kilometers, but that is definitely not a reflection of how people think of Kochi. So there are multiple conceptions of Kochi. There is Greater Cochin Development Authorities area. There is a Kochi city region, which actually goes beyond districts. And there is also the ancient conception of the Kochi Rajav, which is basically the king of Kochi's territory. So all of these multiple ideas of Kochi coexisting together is kind of evident in how land use planning in Kochi is also kind of messed up, because people don't know what boundaries we are talking about. Then there is the unevenness of rapidness, which is what mobility scholars are very much interested in. We talk about Kochi metro rail transforming the way in which mobility happens in the city, but that is not uniform. We see that there are parts of Kochi where the system works very well. There are parts where it doesn't work so much. And then there are parts which are completely untouched by this multi-million-dollar technology. And so that has implications on how people think about it. So the rapid embedding of transport infrastructure was enabled partly by a top-down political expediency. You see that reflected in the newspapers as coming from the chief minister or the central minister of urban development and housing, but never from people below who ask for this to be implemented quickly. There was also a tendency to make a lion out of a certain techno-managerial expert who, beyond any doubt, is a very competent and efficient manager. But the fanfare that you see in the press's coverage of this man's abilities makes you think of him as a superhuman. And that has implications on how democracy works in the state and in the country. And that's a discussion, a very interesting discussion, which unfortunately is not part of today's agenda. Then there is also the framing of convenient alliances. So for a project of this magnitude to work, it requires alliances between agencies, between groups of contradicting interests who are usually at each other's necks. And I saw through the coverage in the press how these alliances were made so that the infrastructure could be deployed. But as soon as the infrastructure was deployed, the contestations kicked in, and those alliances did not last long. And today, in my interviews with some of the stakeholders of these alliances, there is deep-rooted discontent, and the power structures which existed earlier continue to exist, and in fact, they have become worse. So that is one of the problems with getting rapidness constituted this way. There were multiple frictions along the alignment. I tackled this in a different project as part of my thesis. It had to do with something as basic as the bringing together of land as, and even there were issues with dealing with powerful actors versus comparatively powerless actors. So the entire process was kind of characterized by power play, and a lot of it had to do with traditional elites and ordinary everyday Kochiites. And some of those things were really, they were hardly surprising, but they were very interesting. Then there are frictions at interfaces where my colleague Sri Lakshmi and I are working on transport spaces, metro stations, where you see technologies bringing in frictions that previously did not exist, and therefore making it even more difficult for people trying to use the technology to be able to get maximum value out of it. Finally, there are frictions at rolling out of the technology. And so these are everyday incidents such as breaking down of the electric cables or structural defects that come up once in a while. And these were covered majorly because they are visible to the everyday traveler. And I think the reporters kind of thought of them as being human interest stories. And so they find a lot of coverage in these newspapers that I'm looking at. Coming to world-classness, world-classness has been deployed in different ways across Indian cities. There is work by Ananya Roy, there is work by Merriman, Goldman, there's work by Arjun Appadurai, all very interesting pieces of scholarship. Mine is just a humble addition to what they have been doing. The city is different. The ways in which world-classness is being deployed is different. It is being used by Kochi, which, like I told you, is a tier 2 city, to stake claims of having arrived on the national stage and of redeeming its eminent place in the ancient trade routes. Kochi has a 400, 500, 600-year-old port somewhere in Kodunallur, which kind of catered to the spice trade between the colonial powers and the country. And so those kind of networks are also being hinted as people talk more and more about Kochi as a city that has finally arrived. There's also its use as an agent of urban transformation. So with the coming of the metro rail, new projects are being proposed, including pedestrianization, cycling, sidewalks, all basic infrastructures. But there's also talks about renewing the ancient market, about land use values changing, bringing in cheap, affordable, and sometimes luxury housing, and all these kind of different conceptions of what it means to be in Kochi. Finally, there is the abhorrent fetishizing of the infrastructure that is metro rail, where through a combination of governance, material design, just interior design, and regulation, the metro rail is being positioned into something that makes it look like out of Germany or any other European city. So that is kind of, I call it abhorrent, because when you look at other parts of Kochi, these truths are not reflected. You see a huge variation between what you see inside and what you experience inside the metro rail station and what you see outside. And some of those things are very evident in the videos that I was showing you about. Subsequently, they package Kochi as a best practice, which other cities in India and even Sri Lanka and others can actually look up to and replicate. And there's a vast scholarship on the policy mobilities, which looks at it critically. What I found through my research was major intercity mobilities between Kochi and others. The packaging of multiple projects together as one best practice is something that many other cities are now attempting, following the lead of Kochi. There is also a lot of coverage about features of the project, which apparently are supposed to be celebrated. But if you look at it, it is kind of basic. The fact that you have a water metro, for example, in a city that has an excellent network of water bodies should not be an afterthought. It is something that planners and policymakers should think of as a basic. But having done this now, it is being advertised as some kind of, marvelous thing that should have, that should be celebrated. There is a project waiting to be done there on experiencing water as a way of fast versus slow mobility, but sometime later in my career. And finally, there is the reconfiguration of transport spaces in ways that are very difficult to kind of express right now. But it uses cultural tropes, it uses imageries, and it uses physical artifacts to make these spaces into elite spaces of consumption, very different from what a bus station roughly 200 to 300 meters away looks like. And so that includes the branding and renaming and reconstitution of these spaces, which doesn't look very nice when you look at the larger structure. When you look at the timeline of the rhetoric employed by the newspapers, you see that they correspond with key events in the operationalization of the project. So as the construction was being planned, as the project was being conceptualized, there was a lot of coverage about the fact that how is it that Kochi, with a population of 600,000, still doesn't have a metro, when the truth is, across the country, only Delhi and a couple of other cities had a metro. And from my interviews, I've come to know that there were discussions about the usability of BRTS, a bus rapid transit system, versus a metro. And these discussions revolved around costs, etc. But as is the tendency, the so-called higher order infrastructure was selected because it helps the image of the city, and that is problematic. I talked about expanding the urban. So every time a new stretch of the project is operationalized, there is talk about extending it even further into the hinterlands to bring in even more agricultural land, even more settlements into the purview of the Kochi Metro Rail Limited. It is hoped by people in the land market that this will automatically bring their prices up, and that will help them make a quick buck out of the speculative land market that they have been, working in. Rapidness is uneven, and luckily this is reflected uniformly across time. So there is broken sidewalks, there is flooded roadways, there is issues with ticketing, there are issues with different kind of mobile bodies. So infrastructures such as this, they reflect the aspirations of people like me, able-bodied, in their mid-30s, carrying a laptop bag, etc. But they don't cater to the needs of men carrying construction tools that they use every day at their work sites. They do not cater to the needs of fisher folk, who sell fish in the interior parts of Kochi after bringing it from the market in Alua. So all of those things are not kind of covered, and it is kind of a reflection of the elite bias of newspaper industry in our country. Its use as an intercity competition thing is also very fairly evident. So there are comparisons with a neighboring city, which is also the capital of the province called Trivandrum. There is comparison with Mumbai. So like Mumbai is compared with the Shanghai, Kochi is then compared. So these are ways in which the city or its policymakers, its politicians are making their aspirations known. It's a simple way of appealing to the votes, to the voters, and there is a lot of that stuff happening. I covered fetishization of the infrastructure. You will see that happening every time an inauguration happening, because the newspapers are full of coverage of how this very important person came and flagged off a metro rail, and just for the inauguration there will be flowers, and there will be music, there will be celebration. And it will almost make it appear as if it were a day-to-day appearance, which it is not, because moving around in the city is a lot more challenging than that. And finally, it's used as an instrument of urban transformation. So this, I thought, was a good summary of my work on the paper itself. I've also given the themes of press coverage on the top and bottom of this graphic. And so to engage with my second research question, what are the implications of this on mobility studies in Indian cities? So I look at it from three lenses. One is of the relationship between transport infrastructure and capitalist accumulation. Increasingly, as I come to the end, hopefully, of my PhD thesis, I see how transport infrastructure is being operationalized in Indian cities, not as a way of making people's lives better, maybe a little bit of that, but more and more as an instrument of enabling speculative urbanism. And that is deeply problematic in a country which has so many people waiting to be pulled out of poverty. So what this does is it actually shrinks time space. And so capital, owners of capital can now hire a cheaper workforce living 180 kilometers away because they don't have to pay city rents, right? And so therefore there is an impetus, there is an incentive to invest in these transportation systems. There is a bundling of several infrastructure interventions because there's a whole political economy of vendors, policymakers, and their advocates working together in tandem to bring in buzzwords from elsewhere and to operationalize it in a context which has absolutely no contextual fit. And so it results in sometimes very funny images. Finally, it creates these isolated enclaves. I think the urban elites of Indian cities love that because it helps them cut themselves off from the moral problem of having to see poverty on a day-to-day basis, because inside these isolated enclaves, you have battery-operated golf carts transporting you from one end to the other. You have garbage chutes working using technology, vacuum technology, et cetera, et cetera. So again, when you kind of compare that with informal settlements on riverbanks, on public lands, et cetera, it paints a very disturbing picture. There's also stratification within this whole palette of transportation solutions available to transport planners. And that is problematic because then you're pitting walking and cycling, basic ways of inhabiting the city, against a technology-heavy metro rail, hyperloop in the future, but increasingly bullet train, etc. And that pitting is unfair and also idiotic because they kind of cater to very different kinds of mobilities. But increasingly, you see the latter being prioritized at the expense of the former. And that is problematic for mobility scholars such as me and my lab mates. Finally, the more meta question, which hopefully I'll do my postdoc in, I don't know, is that if this is how we conceive mobility, and if this is how we conceive public transport, where is the public in the public transport? You see a very elite section vociferously advocating while policy making and even in the civil society for these kind of solutions, while more and more people are falling away, more and more people who could actually benefit from public transport are falling away into vehicular ownership. And that has major implications on sustainability debates, on environmental debates, on consumption debates, and a whole lot of other things that other disciplines can dig into. So that's it. I just want to introduce you to my lab. There's Govind here, there's Craig, my co-investigator, supervisor, there's Madhav, there's Sarah, who are on my committee, there's Rutul from India, who works on urban mobility solutions. And then I work with all these wonderful colleagues of mine with whom I disagree on many things, but I agree on most things. And so it's fun. I hope you have questions that I would be more than happy to answer now. Thank you. Yes, sir.
How much influence do powerful people in the city have in making a decision of where to put a metro station, where not? Like some people would definitely not want it because they own the land there, or maybe they do want it because they own the land there. And how much do political considerations or power considerations affect the decisions made to where to put metros?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. So elites tend to dominate policy making because policymakers are from the elite business, management, and planning schools, and architecture schools, and engineering schools. And because of how the fee structure of these institutions work, you see very few people from marginalized communities in these positions of decision making. So that is number one. Second, there is an underground way in which some of these decisions are making. We know, but we do not have evidence, so I will not make that claim. But a lot of these discussions, a lot of these decisions are actively made to account for the interests of powerful land holding conglomerates. And so in cities like Delhi, for example, there has been a lot of coverage on the nexus between these two bodies. And subsequently, I would say that the elites have a lot of influence on how these policies are making. There is also, I mean, India prides itself as a democracy, but because of how the idea of democracy has not percolated adequately to the lowest decision-making tier, some of these decisions are very centralized. So decisions made at the center are then made through the state. And by the time they arrive at the city, there is very little scope for the city to meddle with it or make any changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Yogi. Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. This is very interesting work. I was just wondering if you could speak, like how often are some of the discourses framed in terms of like health and environment, both on like an individual and collective level?
In terms of health, some of these ways of moving around in the city have been looked at or are being popularized. So cycling is being looked at from the point of getting exercise in some cities. So there is work in Bangalore, for example, where an elite bunch of information technology workers are using bicycles to get to work, but that's more as a lifestyle choice. In the case of Kochi, there is a small group. They are not very big and they do not have a lot of influence because most people are busy trying to earn their livelihood. And in terms of going around, it's not much.
So I was thinking about the discourse on speed itself and just how much scholarship focuses when it comes to encouraging the adoption of public transport. A lot of scholarship as well as policy heft is spent on making your travel as fast, convenient, and as comfortable as possible. And this as a potential way to draw more people into public transport. Now, this is a discourse that's very prevalent here in the global north, but is also increasingly, I mean, not just increasingly, but has been the justification for putting up public transport infrastructures in the global south. And it's part of the world-classing narrative that you hinted at, I believe. And you also mentioned Metroman E. Sridharan. One of the remarks that I recall of his is that the Delhi Metro, which continues to be a loss-making entity 25 years into operation, is never intended as a profit-making entity,
Right.
and that the fares on the metro should never be hiked in order to make up for the losses. Rather, it should be treated as a social infrastructure, social provision that people need, and ensuring mobility to the masses as he sees it. So reading these two debates together, the affordability of providing expensive public transport, which is expensive apparently everywhere, versus the policy and scholarship heft that is spent on making transport as comfortable, as convenient, as aspirational as possible. Where do you think your work in Kochi might figure in this trade-off debate?
My work in Kochi actively pits two different ways of inhabiting the city. My ethnography helped me experience the city on my feet and on my bicycle. And while I recognize my own eliteness in my interviews with everyday cyclists, everyday street vendors, everyday owners of local food eateries, etc., their aspirations for mobility are an expansion of their ability to take part in more opportunities, as against the shiny infrastructure that the metro rail kind of denotes. Sometimes these infrastructures pass right in front of their shops, right in front of their workplaces, in front of their residences. And in my conversations with them, this sense of the infrastructure being a perverse monstrosity kind of came along, because the fare structures and the ways of accessing this infrastructure were not democratic enough, were not accessible enough for these people. They cannot afford spending 40 rupees to move from point A to point B every day, especially because that point B is located far away from the metro rail station itself. And because we have forgotten to integrate the last mile and first mile connectivity very well with the infrastructure itself, it doesn't address that aspiration of their day-to-day life. And subsequently, like with many other infrastructures such as bullet train and Vande Bharat and everything else, I see a widening gap between everyday aspirations and what the infrastructure provides. And as somebody that has seen this happen with other infrastructures, I suspect that unless other things change, people will just move away from public transport altogether. And therein lies a great challenge for transport policymakers such as us.
Right. Okay, so it looks like we have a question in the chat from Varda. So Varda says, hi, Yogi. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and talk. maybe this is part of your analysis already, but considering the size of Kochi and the notion of metros and technology as spectacles, how do other spectacles like the Kochi Biennale become factors or the initial spectacle that produce these other spectacles like the metro? Or is it the other way around, that mobility enables other spectacles? And maybe secondly, does that mean your research challenges the notion of technology being this great equalizer, especially as you mentioned, if people who need it are actually moving towards privately owned vehicles?
Thank you so much for that question. It's a very interesting question. I've engaged with it in a different project as part of my PhD thesis, where Kochi, actually, the Kochi Metro is just the latest in a long list of spectacles that the city has seen over the last 4 or 5 decades, the last 7 decades after India's independence. And that includes the port, the new port, that includes multiple flyovers, that includes the Vaitila mobility hub. Some of these spectacles actually work towards democratizing mobility, broad-basing mobility, while the others are essentially that. They are spectacles, so they are like an expensive toy which retains its luster and its appeal for the first 2 months, and then you get quickly tired of them. Politicians too, every 5 years when a new election cycle is here, they move on from one of these infrastructures to the next one. And I suspect, what after metro? So this is actually tied to the larger political economy of how transport is looked at, of how infrastructures are looked at. And therefore, I agree with you that instead of technology being this great equalizer, of being that proverbial flood which lifts all boats together, it's actually puncturing some of those boats while letting the other boats rise. And as you see the gaps increasing more and more, you see more and more evidences of social contestation in the denser parts of Kochi. In my conversations with councillors and other representatives of people in some of these poorer parts of Kochi, I noticed that it is becoming increasingly difficult for them to bring youth together for a social cause, because they are so caught up with the everyday need to earn their bread that they have no time or resources to engage with their city in any other capacity, except that it provides them their bread and butter. And that is sad, because it's a city which has had a rich history of activism, of labor movements, of multiple communities living together, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in contestation, but that's part of any multicultural society. So I want to thank you for that question. Thank you.
Hi, Yogi. Nice talk. I mean, in this conversation about metros and public transport, and like how she mentioned how this is being aimed at a large mass who don't have mobility choices, while they're still captive to, let's say, walking and cycling, which a lot of other research has mentioned. I think recently what I've also noticed is a lot of people moving towards, let's say, a motorized mode of motorcycles, scooters, which of course enables easy access to a lot of places. And it's also easy to buy and acquire these kind of modes. So in that context, right, does the metro become a very attractive choice of public transport in a city like Kochi?
The metro in itself, first of all, thank you for your question. The metro in itself does not address all these needs. But when you look at the metro as a package of multiple other projects happening along with it, which promise a greater extent of last mile, first mile connectivity, its case improves. But my understanding of mobility in Indian cities is even the first mile, last mile connectivity will not solve this issue, because this is not a, it's not a distance problem. It is you have to look at it from the social science perspective. Why do people need to move? Who likes moving? And what are the factors which prompt people to work in Kochi and live in Alua or live in Tripunithura? So essentially land markets, etc. So as long as we do not carry out far-reaching reforms in these affiliated things, of which, quite frankly, I don't know too much right now, but as I get deeper and deeper into my examination of these themes over 10 or 15 years, I'll probably know better. But as long as we do not address these associated things, we will not be able to, quote unquote, solve the problem of people moving to private modes of mobility. Because it is not just affordability, it is not just first mile, last mile connectivity, it is not just people's aspirations. It's got to do with a larger ecosystem of man and woman and everybody's needs, which I don't think we understand completely as of now.
Oh, I'm really interested with the last question you posed on the notion of the public. And I was hoping you could connect it back to something you were saying at the beginning about the Delhi metro and how it ended up leading to the transportation of laborers from outside the city, far outside the city, into Delhi in a fairly visceral way. Do you see the same thing happening in Kochi? Do you think the plan will be sort of large enough into the encroaching, or will it encroach into the neighboring areas to really shift labor and capital relationships in the center of the city?
Right. Thank you for that question. Planning in Indian cities is reactive, unfortunately. And a lot of these long-term, day-to-day, daily movements have been happening for decades now. They have been depending on a combination of bus services, which go from point A to B to C to D to finally reach their workplace and back to their place of residence. It has to do with how development is centralized, how employment opportunities are centralized in these major urban centers. And it has to do a lot with how forces of the economy operate. And so while Kochi helps expand our conception of what the urban is, I don't think it is going to radically alter some of these labor capital relations beyond what we know already. Thank you.
Thanks, Yogi. Great talk. The question I had was about, when you were talking about implications, I was wondering what you would think about the implications of Kochi's metro for the particular history. And this is, you didn't mention this in your talk, but Kochi is the largest city in the state of Kerala. And Kerala is known in the development studies literature as being a very unique kind of experiment, very unique history of political mobilization, very dominant kind of left-oriented politics, and at the same time, a very kind of equitable, social welfare driven comparatively in the Indian experience, at least. And so how in that particular context for metro as a technology for this kind of elite aspirations, how did that acquire this much of kind of what's the word I'm missing here?
Popular support?
Yeah, this kind of support for a technology like the metro to become so firmly implanted in the society, in urban society, and become a vehicle for a particular kind of aspirations that are very alien to Kerala and to how would you comment
Indeed.
on that, given your understanding of, I think your fine understanding of mobilization in Kerala and in politics in the city?
Indeed. Everything you said about Kerala is true, but like they say about India, everything opposite to what you said is also true. And that is because Kerala is also home to a lot of people like us who go across the oceans, see what other societies are like. And despite our political leanings, are also deeply aware of the limitations of this kind of development. And so many of these people who then go back to Kerala kind of reproduce the same conversations about the dominant left ideology in ways that are antithetical to their experience of Kerala. Kochi Metro and some of the other projects also in terms of infrastructures are very antithetical to the left discourse. But what is interesting is that the left has also hatched on to the development discourse, so much so that in today's political scenario, you would think of the Left Democratic Front government as more development oriented than the UDF. The current chief minister was an active proponent of the gas line going under people's properties, which 20 years back you cannot imagine. He is also a proponent of the so-called anti-Maoist stance that the government has taken in the northeastern districts of Kerala. And so all these kind of contradictions exist in this larger block of how Kerala behaves. And I keep a close watch on the state's politics because it's a favorite pastime. What I've seen increasingly is that we have also started falling prey to this development-oriented politics discourse. And both the left and the right parties have partaken it in different ways in the last 2 decades, especially. And the metro, therefore, forms part of that. So not only does it reflect the aspirations of the Pravasi Malayali, but it also falls in line with the development-oriented discourse of the politicians and the political parties who have other incentives, which we will not discuss here, because when a new project comes, new incentives open up and all of those things. And, I'm not too harsh on the Left Democratic Front for this, because I think they're also responding to, political leaders are essentially a reflection of what their vote base wants, right? So they are sensing a change in the winds. And I think they are kind of saying that if not us, then they will go to somebody else. So let us do it for them. So I think that is how I kind of explain Kerala also falling prey to this metro Vande Bharat, which is the latest bug right now, and other ways of, mega Lulu malls, etc., etc.
I guess I have a comment more than a question, because it seems like you answered it right now. But I was thinking about how one of your frameworks is about rapid, and how the idea of rapid is often very forward moving, progressive, going to the future, which is also something that is a main concern of all these kinds of infrastructures, technologies. But also at the national level, the politics that we've been having has been so regressive. There's a lot of going backwards. There's a lot of historical revisionism, sort of, going back to the golden age type of thing that's happening all over the world, but also in India. And I wonder if, you've thought about that opposition that exists in the rapid framework and how that's coming across, especially in Kerala, which is willingly or not set up as oppositional to what's going on in the national level.
So it's a reflection of my larger understanding of how politics operates in Kerala. Nobody would have had a problem with rapid if it was accessible to everybody. And if it was a bottom-up idea which came democratically from the bottom to the top. But here, this idea of rapidness is being foisted on us. The 100 kilometers per hour plus trains that are now being rechristened as superfast trains, nobody asked for them. What we asked for them, or at least the reflection that I see in these newspapers that I covered, is that people want more capacity. They don't get seats. They don't get seats on trains. They don't get comfortable traveling experiences. So they want that to be resolved. But what gets resolved? This elite obsession with speed. The kind of popular conversations which preceded these interventions was that ours is the only state where it takes where it takes 10 hours to cover 300 kilometers. How is that possible? We need to be better. But nobody's talking about the fact that so many of us are not able to travel to the neighborhood city in a comfortable way. We are traveling in overcrowded Kerala State Road Transport Corporation public buses, hanging onto its door and things like that. So there is this immense difference between elite aspirations and the aspirations of the rest of us. And unfortunately, like I said earlier, because policymakers have this elite bias, they have this technology bias because they are all engineers and architects from elite institutions. Certain aspirations get addressed while the others remain where they are.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yogi. Do we have any other questions? I think we are done. Thank you all very much for being here. And thank you, Yogi, for this really fascinating talk. We will have our next session in December with Professor Iftikhar Dadi, who'll be giving a talk on Lahore cinema. Hope to see all of you and more there. Thank you all very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, so once again, thank you so much to everyone who joined us online and to those of you who joined us here in the space. We really appreciated having you guys here. Thank you for giving that talk and for organizing this one, Sapernica. So we will catch you at the next one, December 8th. And with that, we'll go ahead, close up the Zoom, and we'll remind you that we are live streaming this to YouTube, so it is available to watch as of right now. So thank you so much and have a great weekend.